Vance Caldwell was not a man accustomed to waiting. As the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, time was his most valuable asset, and yet here he was stuck in an airport lounge with a 24-hour delay, forced to endure an inconvenience he had neither planned for nor had the patience to tolerate. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair as he glanced at the departure board flashing the dreaded words, "Flight cancelled. Next available flight, tomorrow. Unacceptable." He pulled out his phone to call his assistant, but before he could dial, a voice cut through the hum of airport chatter. "Looks like you're stuck here too." Vance turned, his irritation momentarily forgotten as he took in the woman standing beside him. She wasn't dressed in designer labels or trying to get his attention like so many others did when they recognized him. No, she looked effortlessly put together, dark curls framing her face, bright brown eyes filled with amusement, and an oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder. She was holding a cup of steaming coffee, her fingers wrapped around it like she had all the time in the world. "Unfortunately," Vance muttered, slipping his phone back into his pocket. She tilted her head, studying him. "You look like someone who thinks this is the worst thing that's ever happened to them." "It's certainly up there," he exhaled. "I have meetings in London tomorrow morning. This delay isn't exactly ideal." "Ah, a workaholic," she teased. "I take it you're important. Depends on who you ask." He raised an eyebrow. "And you are, Faye Bennett, not important," she shrugged. "Just trying to get back home to New York after visiting my sister in Chicago. Unlike you, I don't have an empire to run." "Good for you," he said dryly. Faye chuckled. "You know, you could take this as an opportunity to relax. Airports are little pockets of limbo, no responsibilities, no expectations, just time." "Time wasted," Vance corrected, "or time well spent depending on how you use it." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes twinkling. "Ever thought about doing something completely unplanned?" Vance didn't do unplanned. His life was meticulously scheduled down to the minute, but something about the way she looked at him like he was missing out on something made him hesitate. "Like what?" he asked, surprising himself. She grinned. "Come on, I'll show you." Before he could protest, she grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the terminal's main concourse. Vance allowed it more out of curiosity than anything else. For the next hour, Faye dragged him through the airport as if they were tourists in a foreign city. She made him try a ridiculously overpriced pastry from a cafe, forced him to sit in one of those massage chairs by the gate, and even convinced him to browse through a tacky souvenir shop. "You should get this," she said, holding up a keychain with a tiny airplane on it. Vance gave her a look. "Why would I need that?" "As a reminder of the time you actually lived a little," she teased. He rolled his eyes but bought the keychain anyway. Somewhere between the overpriced pastries and the ridiculous keychain, Vance realized something unsettling: he was enjoying himself, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. As the hours slipped by, they found themselves sitting in a quiet corner of the lounge, sharing a plate of fries they had no business eating at midnight. "So tell me, Mr. CEO, what's it like having the world at your feet?" Faye asked, popping a fry into her mouth. Vance leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "It's efficient, predictable." She wrinkled her nose. "That sounds terrible," he chuckled. "It has its perks. But do you actually enjoy it?" No one had ever asked him that before. People assumed he loved his life, the power, the wealth, the control, and he did, but enjoy, that was a different question entirely. "I don't think about it," he admitted. Faye studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "That's sad." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting. "You seem like someone who actually enjoys life." "I try to," she said, her voice softer now. "Life's too short to be miserable." There was something in her tone, something unspoken. But before he could press, she stretched her arms above her head and sighed. "All right, Vance Caldwell, since we're stuck together, let's make a deal." He arched an eyebrow. "A deal?" For the next 24 hours, you stop being Mr. CEO and just exist. No work calls, no meetings, no planning your next move. Just be here with me. He should have said no. He should have walked away. Instead, he found himself nodding. Deal. And for the first time in years, Vance Caldwell had no idea what was going to happen next. Vance didn't know when the shift happened. Somewhere between the ridiculous souvenir shop and the shared plate of fries, the hours had melted into something unexpected, something almost surreal. The airport, once a place of frustration, had become a strange little world of its own, separate from the responsibilities and relentless pace of his real life. And at the center of it all was Faye, a woman who didn't seem remotely impressed by who he was, yet somehow held his attention more than anyone had in years. They wandered through the terminal, a place that should have felt sterile and impersonal, but now pulsed with an odd sort of energy. Faye had a way of making even the most mundane things seem like an adventure. She insisted they try on sunglasses at a luxury boutique, pretending to be celebrities avoiding the paparazzi. Then she convinced him to play one of those claw machines filled with stuffed animals, declaring it a personal mission to win, even though the game was blatantly rigged. "You're too tense," she teased as he maneuvered the joystick, his expression one of complete focus. "Like you're negotiating a billion-dollar deal instead of trying to grab a stuffed panda." "Precision is key," he countered, eyes locked on the claw as it descended. The metal prongs closed around the plush toy, lifting it almost triumphantly only for it to slip free at the last second. Faye gasped in exaggerated horror. "No, that was robbery," Vance exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This machine is a scam." "Obviously, but that's not the point," she poked his arm. "Come on, where's your sense of fun?" He glanced at her, at the way her eyes sparkled even under the harsh fluorescent lighting. And then, to his own surprise, he fed another bill into the machine. This time, after a few agonizing seconds, the claw successfully delivered the panda to the prize chute. Faye grabbed it with a victorious cheer. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner." She turned to him, grinning. "I'm naming him Caldwell in honor of your sheer determination." Something strange and unfamiliar twisted in his chest, something dangerously close to amusement. "That's a terrible name for a stuffed panda." "Too late," she said, hugging it to her chest. "Caldwell and I are bonded now." He didn't argue. Instead, he followed her as she led the way toward an empty section of the terminal, where massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the tarmac. They sat side by side on one of the benches, the city lights in the distance casting a soft glow against the night sky. Faye rested her chin on her knee, her voice quieter now. "You know, for someone who was so desperate to leave, you're surprisingly present right now." Vance considered that. "Maybe I needed the distraction." "From what?" he hesitated. It wasn't often that he let anyone in, let alone a stranger he'd only just met, but there was something about Faye, something disarming. "Everything," he admitted. She didn't press him for details, didn't demand explanations. Instead, she simply nodded as if she understood. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a little less like the man who always had to be in control. The hours stretched on, but neither of them made any move to leave. They talked about things that had nothing to do with business or responsibilities. Faye told him about the time she got lost in Paris and ended up crashing a stranger's wedding reception just for the free champagne. He told her about a childhood trip to Italy where he'd accidentally wandered into a private vineyard and had to bribe his way out with a watch he didn't even own yet. At some point, Faye leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of it light but grounding. He didn't move away. "Vance," she murmured. I think I'm glad our flights got canceled." He didn't have a response for that, because against all logic, he was starting to feel the same way. And that was dangerous, because come morning, they'd both be boarding separate planes. And whatever this was, this strange, fleeting connection, it would disappear just as quickly as it had appeared. Morning arrived too soon. The soft hum of the airport filled the space around them as the world awoke, passengers stirring from uncomfortable seats, flight announcements crackling through the intercom. The golden light of dawn spilled through the vast windows, casting a hazy glow over the tarmac. It should have been just another morning, another transition from one place to another. But something had shifted. Vance wasn't ready to leave. Faye stretched beside him, her arms reaching toward the ceiling before she let out a quiet sigh. "Looks like our time in limbo is almost up." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as she absently adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing against the fabric like she was steadying herself for something. It was an odd thing, feeling like something was ending when it had barely begun. "I suppose it is," he said eventually. She glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her gaze. "You sound disappointed." Vance wasn't a man who entertained emotions that weren't productive. Regret was a waste of time, nostalgia a distraction. Yet here he was, sitting in an airport he should have left hours ago, feeling something dangerously close to reluctance. "I don't usually enjoy delays." Faye's lips curved, though there was something softer in her expression now. "Guess I should consider that a compliment." He wanted to say more, to tell her that this wasn't just an amusing diversion from his usual responsibilities, that the idea of boarding his flight felt strangely hollow now. But what was the point? They had 24 hours, that was the deal. And yet, as he stood, as she mirrored his movements, he felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. They walked through the terminal in silence, the weight of the moment pressing between them. Her gait was first. "This is me," she said, shifting her bag higher on her shoulder. He nodded, hands slipping into the pockets of his jacket. For the first time in years, Vance found himself at a loss for words. Faye exhaled, rocking slightly on the balls of her feet. "This is weird, right? Saying goodbye when it feels like we should." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind, forget I said anything." He didn't want to forget. He wanted to ask her what she meant, to demand why it felt like the ground beneath them was shifting in a way that had nothing to do with boarding schedules or departure times. But instead, he did what he always did. He let logic dictate his actions. "It was a good 24 hours, he said, forcing a neutrality into his tone that felt foreign. Faye studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small, almost resigned smile, she stepped forward and, before he could react, pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Take care, Caldwell." And just like that, she was gone. Vance stood rooted to the spot as she disappeared into the crowd, a dull sense of finality settling over him. He had things to do, meetings to attend, a world waiting for him on the other side of the ocean. So why did it feel like he was leaving something behind? The flight to London was smooth, efficient exactly as it should have been. Yet as Vance sat in first class, glass of scotch untouched on the tray beside him, he found himself staring at the keychain Faye had made him buy. It was ridiculous, small and insignificant, yet it felt heavier than it should. He should have asked for her number. The thought came unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. He didn't do spontaneous, didn't chase after things that weren't guaranteed. But Faye had thrown his carefully structured world into something unrecognizable in the span of a single night. By the time he landed in London, he had convinced himself it was for the best. She had her life. He had his. Except, weeks later, he found himself back in New York for a business meeting, stepping out of his car onto a bustling street when something, or rather, someone stopped him in his tracks. Faye. Standing outside a cafe, laughing at something the barista had said, her curls bouncing as she shook her head. She looked different in the daylight, yet exactly the same. It took him 3 seconds to make a decision. Vance strode forward. She turned just as he reached her, her eyes widening in surprise. "Vance," he allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "Looks like I finally missed my flight." And for the first time in a long time, he didn't regret a thing. Faye's stunned expression quickly gave way to something softer, something unreadable. She blinked up at him as if trying to determine whether he was real or just a figment of her imagination. "You're here," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. Vance nodded, his gaze steady. "I am." 1,000 questions flickered across her face, but she didn't ask any of them. Instead, she exhaled, tilting her head slightly as if assessing him. "No private jets to catch, no meetings halfway across the world." "Not at the moment," his lips twitched. "And even if I did, I think I'd rather be here." Something shifted in her eyes, hesitation, curiosity, maybe even something deeper. She studied him for a beat longer before shaking her head, as if chastising herself. "All right, Caldwell," she said, crossing her arms. "What's your plan this time?" For the first time in his life, Vance didn't have one. He was always 3 steps ahead, calculating outcomes, ensuring control over every variable. But this was unknown territory. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I'm not ready to walk away." Faye's breath hitched just faintly, but she quickly masked it with a teasing smile. "That's very unlike you. Maybe you're a bad influence," she laughed, shaking her head. "Or maybe you're finally learning how to be in the moment." Vance wasn't sure what he was learning, only that he wanted more. More time, more moments like the ones they had stolen in that airport, more of the way she looked at him like he wasn't just a name on a Forbes list, but a person worth knowing. "Let me take you to dinner," he said, the words out before he could second-guess them. Faye arched an eyebrow. "Just dinner, for now." A challenge flickered in her expression, but she didn't deny him. Instead, she glanced down the street, then back at him. "All right, Caldwell. But if it turns out you have a whole itinerary planned, I'm walking out." Vance chuckled. "No itinerary," she hummed, unconvinced, but finally nodded. "All right. Let's see what you've got." And just like that, they stepped into something new. Dinner turned into a long walk through the city, the remnants of winter clinging to the air as they wove through streets that pulsed with life. Vance had never been one for idle strolls, but with Faye, everything felt different. The pace of the world slowed, the hum of passing cars and scattered laughter fading into background noise. She led the way, pointing out little cafes she loved, street vendors with the best coffee, quiet bookstores tucked between towering buildings. She spoke with the ease of someone who belonged here, who had built a life out of moments rather than schedules. Vance listened, absorbed. "What about you?" she asked at one point, glancing up at him. "Do you ever just exist in a city, or are you always moving too fast to notice?" "I notice," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I just don't usually stop." Faye's gaze lingered on him, something unreadable passing through it. "And now," he didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached for her hand. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, warm and steady. They walked like that for blocks, hand in hand, as if this was something they had always done. Vance had never believed in fate. Life was built on decisions, on actions, on control. But as he sat across from Faye in a dimly lit restaurant, watching the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as she laughed at something he said, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, some things were meant to happen. He had met her in a moment of inconvenience, a delay that should have been nothing more than an irritation. And yet, here they were. "I think you're stuck with me, Bennett," he murmured, watching her reaction carefully. Faye leaned forward slightly, her eyes flickering with amusement. "Is that so?" he nodded, unwavering. "I don't walk away from things that matter." Her expression softened, the teasing edge giving way to something real, something unspoken, and in that moment, Vance knew he wasn't going anywhere. And neither was she. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Vance had ever experienced. His life had always been built on structure, on control, on knowing exactly what came next. But with Faye, there were no carefully laid out plans, no meticulously scheduled meetings. There was only the unpredictable pull of wanting to see her again, and again. He found excuses to extend his time in New York. shifting meetings that could have easily been conducted remotely just so he had a reason to stay. He told himself it was logical New York was a hub of business after all, but deep down he knew the truth. It had nothing to do with work. Faye had slipped into his world with an ease that unsettled him. She didn't demand his time, didn't expect grand gestures or lavish gifts. She was content with stolen hours between obligations, with simple walks through the city, with coffee in hand as they sat on park benches and talked about everything and nothing. It should have been temporary, but every time he thought about leaving, about boarding a plane and returning to the life he had built, something inside him resisted. One evening, he found himself waiting outside the cafe she loved, leaning against his car as the city buzzed around him. When she finally stepped out, her expression shifted from surprise to something softer. "You again," she teased, tucking her hands into the pockets of her coat as she approached. He opened the passenger door without a word, an invitation rather than a request. She hesitated for only a moment before sliding inside. As he pulled into the steady flow of traffic, she glanced at him with quiet curiosity. "Where are we going? You'll see." For once, it wasn't about business or strategy. It wasn't about making the right move or ensuring the perfect outcome. It was about her, about them. He drove north, away from the noise of the city, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror as the roads stretched into something quieter. Faye didn't press for details, simply watching the world pass by with the same easy patience she always carried. When he finally pulled into the secluded property, she glanced around, taking in the vast stretch of land, the lights from the nearby lake reflecting in the distance. "This is yours?" she asked, stepping out of the car. "One of my properties," he admitted. "I don't use it often." She turned to him, a challenge in her gaze. "And why bring me here?" Vance exhaled, searching for the right words. He wasn't a man who confessed feelings easily, who spoke in flowery declarations. But Faye had never needed embellishments, only the truth. "Because I wanted to be somewhere without distractions," he said. "Somewhere that doesn't feel like borrowed time." She was quiet for a long moment, the night air wrapping around them as the distant sound of water lapped against the shore. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his in a way that felt effortless. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see what this place has to offer." He led her inside, the warmth of the fireplace casting a golden glow across the space. It was minimal, untouched, more of a retreat than a home. But tonight, with her standing in the center of it, it felt different. They spent the evening by the fire, a bottle of wine between them, conversation flowing as freely as it had that night in the airport. But this time, there was no looming goodbye, no flight departure dictating their time. At some point, Faye leaned against him, her head resting just beneath his chin. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her there as the fire crackled softly. "This feels dangerously close to domestic," she mused, her voice laced with something teasing yet sincere. Vance let out a quiet breath, his fingers tracing absent patterns against her arm. "Maybe I don't mind that as much as I thought I would." She tilted her head to look at him. "Are you saying the great Vance Caldwell is capable of slowing down?" He met her gaze, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. "I think I'm saying you make me want to." The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Faye's expression softened, her fingers tightening slightly against his. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone like me." "Why?" "Because I might just make you prove it." Vance wasn't afraid of challenges, he thrived on them, but this wasn't a challenge. This was a choice, and he had already made it. As the fire burned low and the night stretched on, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't going anywhere. The quiet rhythm of their world together had settled into something neither of them had expected: effortless, natural, and dangerously real. Vance found himself making more time than he ever had before. Meetings were rescheduled, calls were pushed back, and New York became less of a stop on his itinerary and more of a place that tethered him. Because Faye was here, and he wasn't willing to let go. One evening, as they walked through the city streets, the scent of rain lingering in the air, Faye suddenly pulled him toward a small bookstore tucked between towering buildings. The warm glow of the lights inside cast a golden hue over the sidewalk, the scent of aged paper and fresh coffee greeting them as they stepped in. Vance watched as Faye moved through the rows of books, her fingers grazing the spines with an absent-minded reverence. She wasn't searching for anything in particular, just existing in the space, and there was something about her that made his chest tighten in a way he wasn't used to. He had spent his life chasing the next deal, the next goal, the next win. But here with her, there was no rush, no strategy, just the simple act of being. Faye turned, catching his gaze as she held up a book. "This one," she said, her voice light. "I feel like you need it." He arched a brow, taking it from her hands. The title was something poetic, something about slowing down and appreciating the little things. He chuckled. "You think I need self-improvement?" Her lips curved into something knowing. "I think you've already started improving, you just don't realize it yet." He didn't argue, because maybe, just maybe, she was right. As they left the shop, the city stretching wide before them, Faye slipped her hand into his without hesitation. It was such a simple gesture, yet it grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. And in that moment, Vance knew this wasn't something fleeting. This wasn't a distraction, this was real. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Vance didn't do uncertainty. He didn't gamble with things that had the power to unravel him. But Faye wasn't a calculated risk, she was a force that had rewritten every rule he had ever lived by. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for an exit strategy. One evening, as they sat together in her small apartment, her world so different from his sprawling penthouse, he found himself studying the way she fit into the space. The books stacked on the coffee table, the photographs pinned haphazardly to the walls, the half-finished painting leaning against the window. Every inch of the place felt like her, unrestrained, full of life in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Faye caught him staring and tilted her head. "What's going on in that complicated mind of yours?" Vance exhaled, setting his glass down. "I was just thinking." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't want this to be temporary." Her breath hitched, just faintly, but she didn't look away. "Neither do I." The words settled between them, solid and real. Vance reached for her, his fingers threading through hers as he pulled her closer. "Then let's stop pretending it has to be," he murmured. She studied him for a long moment, as if committing every detail to memory. Then, with quiet finality, she whispered, "Okay." And just like that, the last of his reservations faded. Because Faye wasn't just something he wanted. She was something he wasn't willing to lose. Months passed, and what had started as an unexpected detour in an airport had turned into something permanent. Vance had never imagined his life could shift so drastically, that he could find himself rearranging priorities not out of obligation but out of desire. But Faye had changed everything. One evening, as they walked through Central Park beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, he pulled her to a stop beneath the soft glow of a street lamp. Faye looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "What is it?" Vance took a breath, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the small, ridiculous keychain she had made him buy that night in the airport. She laughed softly, her fingers brushing over the tiny airplane. "You kept it." "Of course." His voice was steady, certain. "Because that night changed everything." Her expression softened, and before she could respond, he reached into his other pocket, pulling out something far more significant, a small velvet box. Faye's breath caught, her fingers tightening around his. Vance held her gaze, his voice unwavering. "I never believed in fate. But meeting you, losing my flight that night, was the best thing that ever happened to me." He exhaled, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. so I don't want to leave anything up to chance. I want you, Faye, for more than just borrowed moments, for a lifetime." She stared at him, eyes shining, lips parted in disbelief. Then, with a soft, breathless laugh, she whispered, "Yes." Vance barely had time to react before she threw herself into his arms, her laughter mixing with his as he spun her around. And in that moment, beneath the golden light of the city, Vance Caldwell, billionaire, CEO, a man who had spent his life chasing success, realized he had finally found the one thing that had been missing all along. Love, and he wasn't letting it go, not now, not ever.